Thank you. So good afternoon, Your Excellency Matar El-Tayir, Director General, Chairman of the Board of Executive Directors, Road and Transportation Authority, and Commissioner General of Infrastructure, Urban Planning, and Wellbeing Pillar. It is a pleasure to be here. So as mentioned, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, which is a mix of neuroscience and psychology, and I bring in behavioral economics as well. I bring people into my lab, and I try to understand the brain mechanisms that give rise to how people act every day, how they interact, how they make decisions. And today I want to focus on your future. Humans have an incredible ability to imagine the future. It fosters innovation and creativity, but our ability to imagine the future also comes with some constraints. It's constrained by our past, by what we want to be true, and our current beliefs. So I'm going to share with you what we've learned about how people imagine the future. So this great ability has some biases and hurdles to it. And I want to start by having you imagine your future 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Think about your career, think about your family. Try to have really vivid images in your mind. So if I was to look inside your brain at this very moment, I would see something like this. So this is a slice of the brain, if I was to cut it like this and look inside, and I'm highlighting the regions that are especially active when you think about the future. Now, what's interesting about this is that we see the same pattern when people remember the past. And this makes sense because in order to imagine the future, you need to retrieve events from your past and combine them together to create something new. For example, imagine your next summer vacation. You retrieve past summer vacations and combine them for this imagination. Indeed, amnesics who are unable to remember the past have difficulties thinking about tomorrow, next week, next month. Kids generate the ability to remember the past around the same time they have the ability to imagine the future. So what all of this means is that imagining the future can be constrained by the past. We imagine new things, but they're often a combination of old things. Here's an example. So here's an artist 100 years ago imagining how school will be in the year 2000. You can see he's combining things that were around him at the time. There's a mincemeat maker, but it's not mincing meat, it's mincing books, and the information is coming through electrodes directly to the brains of the students. And it seems that he's imagining learning in the future to be more effortless, perhaps even better. So let's go back to your own imagination. Come up with those images of you in the future. Who here comes up with positive images in their mind? Just put your hand up. So this is quite common. When you ask people, they usually imagine the future even better than the past or the present. And if you look, you might notice that there's one region that is very strongly activated when you imagine the future, and it doesn't come up as much when you remember the past. It's called the nucleus accumbens, and it's the reward center of the brain. People imagine the future as rosier than they remember the past. For example, I'm going to ask you a few specific questions about your own future. Number one, how likely is it that you will prosper financially and professionally? Number two, how optimistic are you about the future of your family? Number three, how likely is it that you will get COVID? And number four, how optimistic are you about the rest of the families in this room? Let's look how most people answer these questions, and we're going to start with professional success. So out of every 3 small businesses in the US, only 1 will remain standing in 5 years. That is 33%. But when you ask small business owners about their own likelihood of success, 81% say it will be them that remain standing. That means that half of them are going to be unpleasantly surprised when they fail. What about health? At the beginning of the pandemic, we asked people, how likely is it that you will get COVID? And we found that most people said they're less likely to get COVID than other people the same age and gender. However, at the same time, they thought that COVID was a great threat to the population at large. So this is an example of what we call private optimism, but public despair. People tend to be optimistic about themselves and their families and their close people around them, but not necessarily about the world at large. And one of the reasons is a sense of control. We have a sense that we are in control over our own future. We can steer the wheel in the right direction, and so we're optimistic. But we don't necessarily believe we have control over the world at large, and so we're not necessarily optimistic about global issues. For example, 3 out of 4 people said they are optimistic about the future of their own family. That's 75%. But only 30% said that they thought the next generation will be doing better than the current one. And one last example, out of every 4 people, 3 said AI will take more jobs than it will create. That's 75%. But only 1 in 4, only 25% said their jobs were at risk. So predictions are constrained by wishful thinking. And this is also known as the optimism bias, which is our tendency to overestimate our likelihood of experiencing positive events, such as professional success and having talented kids, and underestimate the likelihood of negative events, such as accidents or illnesses. And we see this in about 80% of the population. We see this in the Western world, in the non-Western world. We see this in females and males in different ages. And so when people hear about this, they usually ask, well, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And the answer is yes. So on the positive side, if we have optimistic predictions, that reduces stress and anxiety, and that's good for both our mental health and our physical health. Also, it enhances exploration. If I believe there are good things out there for me to find, I'm more likely to go out and explore. Optimism is also related to professional success in fields ranging from sports to academia to business. And the reason is, if you think you're going to do well, if you think you're going to get that promotion, you put more effort into it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think, well, that's not going to work out, you don't put in the effort, and again, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in other words, our predictions impact our actions, and our actions impact the outcomes. So in some ways, optimism frees us from the constraints of the past when imagining the future. However, if we underestimate our risk, we might not take precautionary action. We might not go to medical screenings when we should. We might not put a helmet when cycling or put a belt while driving. So the question is, how do we gain the fruits of optimism, but at the same time protect ourselves from the potential negative outcomes? Well, first of all, if we know that 80% of the people around us tend to be overly optimistic and overly confident, that means that when we are assessing recommendations and advice from others, we need to remember to assess their competence, not their confidence. Now, this seems obvious. However, humans have a heuristic by which we assume that people who are more confident are also more accurate. And that is not necessarily the case. So we need to make sure to ask for the data, ask for rationale, and take that into account when making a decision, trying to take away from our consideration the other person's confident. Okay, great. But what about our own biases? Well, if we know what our bias is, we can think through what are the potential negative outcomes and then put in a policy in place to protect ourselves. Let me give you a specific example to illustrate this point. So the British government has a book that's called the Green Book, which is a book with recommendations for project appraisers. And in the book, they say that there is an optimism bias, so they're aware of the bias, and they say, given the optimism bias, people tend to underestimate how long projects will take to complete and how much they will cost. So they identified the potential negative outcome. And then they say, all the projects in the British government have to be corrected for the optimism bias. And indeed, they did that for the 2012 Olympic budget, which was relatively on budget relative to other Olympics. So how do they do that? That's where the policy comes in place. They have a very long PDF to explain this, but the principle is quite simple. They look at other similar projects, so in this case, other Olympics, look at the predictions of budget and how long it will take, look at the outcomes, calculate the average bias, and then add that to their own predictions. So this is great, but it still leaves a bit of a mystery, which is, where is these optimistic predictions coming from? Why are we constantly underestimating budget, constantly underestimating how long projects will take? I mean, we go through life experiencing events, right? So we should learn. We should correct our predictions. Some projects are successful, some are not. This was quite a mystery for me as a neuroscientist because according to every learning theory, we should not end up with a bias. And so we conducted a study to try to understand what exactly is going on that is generating these overly optimistic predictions. We brought people into our lab, and we asked them to estimate their likelihood of experiencing all sorts of negative events. For example, what is the likelihood that you will be a victim of card fraud? And 80 different events. Have an accident, go bankrupt, and so on. So they put in their estimate, and then we gave them information about the average likelihood from someone like them, their age, their gender, living in their city, to experience this event. So card fraud, for example, can be about 70%. And then we asked them again, okay, now that you got the information, what do you think? What is the likelihood that you will be a victim of card fraud, be in a car accident, have cancer? We wanted to know whether people will take the information that we gave them to change their risk estimates. And indeed they did, but mostly when the information was better than what they expected. So for example, if someone started off saying, I think my likelihood of being a victim of card fraud is about 90%, and we said, hey, good news, it's only about 70%, the next time around, they said, oh, well, maybe it's around 75% or so. So they learned quickly and efficiently. However, if someone started off saying, I think my likelihood is about 30%, and we said, hey, bad news, it's more like 70%, the next time around, they said, for me, I think it's still about 33%. So it's not that they didn't learn at all, but they learned much less when the information was worse than expected than when the information was better than expected. And it's not that they didn't remember the statistics. They remembered the average likelihood of card fraud, the average likelihood of a car accident, but they didn't think it was related to them when it was worse than their own prediction. So we wanted to know what goes on inside the human brain that prevents us to learn well from unexpected negative news. So we conducted our study again, this time recording people's brain activity. So the way that it works is people come into our lab, they lie down like this, there's a head coil on top of their head with a little mirror. And on the mirror, they can see everything that we put on a screen behind them. So we can put in the questions and so on, and they respond using the button boxes in both hands. So what we found was that when people got good news, they learned you're less likely to be a victim of card fraud than they thought. The brain responded quite fiercely in many different regions, including this region here called the left inferior frontal gyrus. And it didn't matter what type of person you were. You could be highly optimistic, slightly pessimistic, even slightly depressed. Everyone's brain really responded well to positive news. On the other side of the brain, the right inferior frontal gyrus was responding to negative information, and it wasn't doing as good a job. And the more optimistic someone was, according to trait questionnaires, the less likely their brain was to encode this unexpected negative information. So we were wondering, can we change this? Can we change the way that people process information by changing brain activity directly? And there's a way for us to do that. So this is my collaborator, and what he's doing is he's passing a small magnetic pulse through the scalp of this participant. And by doing this, he can interfere with the activity of a brain region for about half an hour. And after that, everything goes back to normal, or so we hope. But doing this half an hour, we can do our task on individuals and see how they behave. So let's see what happens. Well, first of all, if I were to test all of you here now, this is the average amount that you would learn more from good news and bad news. Then, when we interfered with a brain region that was encoding negative information, we interfered with it, the bias was enhanced. And when we interfered with the brain region that was encoding positive information, we interfered with it, the bias was eliminated altogether. Now, we were quite amazed by this because we were able to eliminate a deep-rooted bias in humans. But of course, we're not going to go around zapping people's brains, right? And so what this means that on average, when people see warning signs such as this, they say, yes, smoking kills, but mostly kills the other guy. But when they hear that the housing market is going to go up, they say, oh, my house will definitely rise in price. So knowing this, knowing that the brains around us will take in the positive more than the negative about the future, what this means is that to communicate, we need to reframe our message by highlighting the opportunity for progress rather than decline. For example, instead of telling someone if you take route A, you will lose time and money, you might say if you take route B, you will gain time and money. Or instead of telling a teenage kid, if you smoke, you will get cancer, which is highlighting the decline, you might say, if you don't smoke, you'll be more likely to get on the basketball team. So highlighting the potential for progress. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean sugarcoating anything. If someone did a job and it was not a good job, it doesn't mean saying, oh, that's fine, or finding the small bits that they did right. That's not the idea. The idea is that instead of saying, this is terrible and now we're going to lose a client, right, the decline, we could say, this is what needs to be done now in order to get to our goal. But let me give you an empirical example of how this has been used. So this is an example that I like a lot, and it's especially relevant today because it has to do with hand washing. So we all know that hand washing is a #1 way to reduce the spread of disease. And this is especially important in hospitals and in restaurants. So in a hospital in New York State, a camera was installed to see how often medical staff wash their hands before and after entering a patient's room. Now, the medical staff knew that the camera was installed. It wasn't a nanny camera situation. And yet, only 1 in 10 medical staff washed their hands before and after entering a patient room. But then an intervention was introduced, an electronic board that told the medical staff how well they were doing. So every time they sanitized their hands, the numbers went up, indicating the current shift rate and the weekly rate, and they got a little message saying, well done, good shift. And what happened? Compliance raised to almost 90% and stayed there. Now, this is really an incredible increase, so great that the scientists wanted to make sure it was real, so they replicated it in another division in the hospital. Here, the medical staff started at 30%, so 1 in 3 medical staff washed their hands before and after entering a patient's room. Again, the intervention was introduced, poof, went up to 90% compliance rates and stayed there. So why does this intervention work so well? The answer goes beyond hand washing or hospitals. It's much more general than that. It works well because instead of using the normal approach, what would be the normal approach? It would be to highlight to the medical staff that if they don't wash their hands, there'll be disease in the future, right? Decline. Instead of doing that, they highlighted the current shift rate going up, right? The progress, the numbers going up. And they did another thing. They gave the medical staff immediate rewards. Every time they washed their hands, immediately, there was a message saying, good shift, well done. We have reason to believe that immediate rewards are especially powerful at triggering action, more so than the threat of a punishment. And this is because of something known as the approach avoidance principle. Let me tell you what this is. So, to get the good stuff in life, whether it's chocolate cake or a promotion, you need to act, you need to do something, right? I'm thirsty, I need to move my hand and get water to drink. And so our brain has evolved in this kind of environment where the anticipation of a reward is related to action. And so when you anticipate something good, a go signal is activated deep in your brain, goes all the way to your reward center into your motor cortex, and makes actions more likely. On the other hand, to avoid the bad stuff in life, whether it is poison or deep waters or untrustworthy people, we often just need to not do anything, right? And so our brain has evolved in this kind of environment where the anticipation of something bad is related to a no-go signal going deep in our brain all the way to our motor cortex and inhibiting action. Of course, we're sophisticated creatures. We can overcome this, but our immediate reaction is to freeze. And so you can see why, if we go back to the medical staff, just threatening them of something bad in the future did not elicit the action of washing their hands. However, giving them a simple, positive feedback reward was much more likely to change their behavior. I mean, we know that people go out of their way for those likes on Facebook, right? So these immediate rewards, whether they're monetary or social, are extremely effective. Okay, so everything that I told you so far about people having an optimism bias and learning more from the good news and the bad news is true for most individuals in most situations. However, the laws of the mind are not quite like physics. We don't have one rule that is always true, like gravity. It matters what the context is. It matters who's in front of you. And one thing that matters a lot is, what is your mental state? When people are under stress, that really changes the way that their brain functions, and it makes them hypervigilant on the negative news. We found this in a study where we brought people into our lab and we wanted to stress them out. These were students. So we told them that they're going to have to give a speech in front of everyone else on a topic that we will give them, a surprise speech. They're going to be rated, they're going to be judged, they're going to be videotaped, and we're going to put it on YouTube. So our students got quite stressed. They told us that they were stressed. We checked their cortisol in their saliva. When you're stressed, your cortisol goes up. It was enhanced. We checked their skin conductance. When you're stressed, you start sweating, and skin conductance goes up. That was enhanced too. And then we gave them the experiment that I told you about before, where they have to estimate their risk, and we give them information. And we found that when they were under stress, they started focusing on the negative information. They learned from it perfectly well, and there wasn't a difference anymore in learning from positive and negative. We did the same with firefighters in the state of Colorado. So firefighters have days where they're quite relaxed, they're in their engine, they're in the station, cleaning their engines, and some days are life-threatening events, right? While they were on duty, we gave them our experiments. And again, we found that when the firefighters were stressed, they focused on the negative information we gave them. When they were relaxed, they learned more from the positive than the negative. So you can see how this relates to public stressful events, such as a market collapse or a pandemic. Under those situations, people get quite stressed. And then they start focusing on the negative information around them, which at the time there's a lot of in the media. And that can cause overly pessimistic predictions of the future and sometimes suboptimal decisions. For example, after the market collapse, people tend to sell their stocks when really they should be holding on. This turns out to be related to how old you are. So it turns out that stress changes throughout age in a predictable manner. So on average, stress is relatively low in teenagers and kids, and it goes up, 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 reaching peak in your midlife, and then starts going down. And happiness goes the other way. So happiness starts quite high in teenagers and kids. It goes down, 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 reaching rock bottom in your midlife, and then the good news is it starts going up again. People are not aware of this, but happiness is quite high in the elderly until the last couple years of life. So the question now is, what happens if this is you, or this is a person you're interacting with, and what you're trying to do is reduce stress, enhance well-being, enhance optimism? Well, it turns out that one thing that is especially important for people's current happiness is not what they're doing at the moment, but what they believe they will be doing in the future, tomorrow, next week, next month, even next year. There is a joy in anticipating the future, which makes us happy at the present time. Let me give you a couple of examples of this, and then ask how can we use this knowledge to better ourselves and others. So in one study that was conducted at Harvard, people who were about to go on vacation were asked every day before vacation how happy they were, every day during vacation how happy they were, and every day after vacation how happy they are. And do you want to guess what was the happiest day of all those 3 weeks? It was a day before vacation. The day before the vacation, they were still in the office, they were on computers, but in their mind, they were already on vacation. And in their mind, it was quite wonderful. It wasn't as wonderful, and then when they went on vacation, it was great, but it wasn't as great as it was in their mind the day before. So the day before was the happiest day. And this relates to this other interesting little finding. So let me ask you, think about what is your favorite day of the week? Who says Thursday? Couple for Thursday. Sunday? One. Saturday? You. And Friday? Yeah, so nice. It might be my own bias, but I think Friday won here. And that's exactly what you find. When you ask people about their favorite day of the week, people tend to like Friday more so than Sunday. And this is true all over. So this is true also in the United States and European countries where Saturday and Sunday is the weekend, right? And Friday is a day of work. So people prefer Friday, working on Friday, than they do Sunday. Why is that? Well, Friday brings with it the anticipation of the weekend ahead, while Sunday brings with it the anxiety of the work week. So people prefer the Friday, even though they're in the office, than Sunday, even though they might be outside playing in the park. What does this all mean? Okay. Well, if anticipation makes us happy, it means that it is important for us to create anticipatory events, events that we could look forward to, that are on our calendar, both personal and professional, that will make us happy at present time. And this is one way to reduce stress and enhance well-being. There's another factor that is really important. And let me tell you what it is. So just when the pandemic started, and also a few months later, we were interested in what were the most important factors that protected people during the pandemic, protected their well-being. Which factors were related to happiness during the pandemic? And we found that the number one factor was a sense of control. So people who had a sense that they are in control over their own life, they were much more likely to be happy. People who had a sense that they didn't have control were not as happy. And during the pandemic, control was taken away from people, right? You couldn't decide when you're going to go out, what you're going to do. That had a negative effect. But people who were able to maintain that did much better. Now, income was a second factor. So income was important for people's happiness during the pandemic, but as you can see, it had only half the effect than a sense of control. There are other things that mattered. So age. Older people did better than teenagers and people in their 20s, so older was a little bit better. People with good health insurance, that was important. And also the amount of risk that you thought you were in. So people who estimated the risk of COVID as lower were happier. Okay, but control was the number one factor. So what does that mean? Well, in fact, it's not so surprising because the number one thing your brain is trying to do at all times, it's trying to control its environment in order to gain reward and avoid harm. So any time that we feel we're in control, we have agency, that enhances our well-being. Any time that we feel our agency has been restricted, that causes anxiety. This is one of the reasons that people are quite anxious on planes. It's not only that they fear the worst, but also because on a plane you have no control. You have no control about where the plane is going, when you're going to get there, even what you're going to eat. And that causes quite a bit of anxiety. So a way to enhance well-being is to give people agency. And one way to do that is to give people choice. What we and others have found is that when you give people a choice, they become much more committed to the option that they chose relative to if someone else tells them what to do. Let me give you a specific example. So imagine that you can choose between two projects at work. One will take you to London, and the other will take you to New York. And they both look great, and you don't know what to choose, and you say, OK, I'm going to choose New York. What we find is that seconds after making this decision, people reevaluate the options, they rationalize a choice, and they say, well, good thing I didn't choose London. It's gray and rainy there, and it's a great thing that I choose New York. I'm going to see wonderful theater. So now they think that the option that they chose is better than they did just a few seconds ago before the choice. And when we looked at the brain activity while people were doing that, we found that in the reward center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, which I told you about before, it was responsive much more to options after people chose them relative to before. So people got more committed to the route when they chose themselves. And it doesn't work if someone else makes a choice for you. So what does that mean? It means that instead of telling people what to do, we want to give them a few options, maybe 2 or 3. Now, you don't want to give people too many options. You may have heard about the famous jam experiment, where people were given an option to choose between 60 different jams, and some people were so overwhelmed by the number of choices, they left the store empty-handed. So not too many choices, but 2 or 3 are good. And you can direct people toward the option that you think best. As long as they believe that they made the choice themselves, they'll be more committed and happy with the option. Okay, so we're not necessarily aware of how our brain works. So we're not aware of the fact that normally we learn more from the positive than the negative, and that causes optimism bias, but not under stress, in which case we are hypervigilant to the negative. That making a choice changes the way that we view the options, that anticipation makes us happy at the moment. But once we become aware of this, this means that we become better able to make decisions for ourselves, as well as communicate with others. So a few things that we talked about was assessing competency, not confidence, when taking on advice from others, because most people tend to be overly confident in their predictions. Thinking about our biases and trying to figure out what are the potential negative outcomes, and then putting in a policy in place to protect yourself. Highlighting the opportunity of progress rather than decline. Identifying immediate rewards. What are the immediate rewards that people can get by taking an action? Even if the action can benefit you in the future, what are the rewards that I can get now? Consider mental state. Under stress, people will be focused on the negative. Create anticipatory events that people look forward to in order to enhance their well-being at the moment. And expand agency by giving people a choice. So when people hear about this type of work, they tend to ask, okay, well, now that I know about it, does it mean that all these biases and tricks that the brain is playing on me are going to go away? And the answer is no. Knowing about these tricks will not make them disappear, but it does mean that you can use them. And the last point that I'm going to make is I'm going to show you an example of this using a visual illusion. Okay? I want you to look at this image here and try to kind of think about what does it look like. So, seems like an upside-down photo of a smiling girl, right? Okay, let's test this perception. When I turn it upside down, it's quite clear that something is wrong, right? But when I turn it, upside right, it looks like something is wrong. But when I look at it upside down, it's not as obvious. Why is that? Well, our brain has evolved to perceive upright faces. We see them all the time, thousands, right, every day. And so our brain is an expert at perceiving upright faces. Anything that's a little bit odd, we're going to see it. But we don't really see upside-down faces so much, so our brain hasn't evolved to detect things that are unusual in upside-down faces. And so we are fooled. This, if you want to do this at home, what you need to do is just cut out the eyes, cut out the mouth, rotate them, and paste them back. Okay, but what is the point of this demonstration? The point of this demonstration is to show you that despite the fact that I explained the illusion to you, and you saw it evolve right in front of your eyes, it's still there, right? It didn't go away. And the same is true for those other tricks and biases that I told you about, the decision-making biases and prediction biases. Knowing about them are not going to make them go away. However, it will help us in our decision-making. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you so much.